think it's working.
All right.
Cool.
So we're live.
Yes, pseudo live.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So I guess one question would be, where did your initial fascination with the troll stories kind of come from, and its connection to popular culture?
Yeah, so I've always been interested in like mythology and fairy tales and those kind of things. And actually it started when I was a university student, so around like 2002 or something. And at that time, I was playing quite a lot of games and so on. So like, World of Warcraft. I didn't play World of Warcraft, but Warcraft 3 and other games.
Oh yeah.
And I started to notice how our image of the troll, or all creatures from mythology, they are turning into like numbers. This kind of creature has this kind of axe, and it does this amount of damage. And like the story element is kind of getting lost in this number.
I
These
see.
numbers. So that's what I started to notice, that maybe something is happening. And then I got interested in trolls. And after a little bit after that, I think trolls started a new transformation. So I was wrong about thinking it was about turning into a number game. It's not at all. But that's how that's why I was kind of afraid we might lose our stories and so on, and just turning it into numbers and damage and all of this.
Yeah.
But we are not. We are
fully embodying the stories.
Yeah, definitely.
That is an interesting point too. I had not considered that, and it seems to have actually started quite a long time ago with the creation of games like Dungeons and Dragons, where we started taking these it's almost like we started quantifying life so that we could turn it into a type
sheets.
Yes and like what the size
agility
means in numbers and stuff like that. That's interesting.
But I think that theory is false.
Well, it almost seems like in some sense it enabled us to kind of like re-enter into the mythos from like a more abstracted perspective.
From a modernistic perspective. Like,
yes, yeah. And like
through numbers.
Brought our defenses down.
Story.
Yeah. Interesting, yeah.
So that's how it started. My interest started.
I see. And I'm guessing as well from certain parts of your video, and I think you brought it up with Paul, that you're interested in Pajot and his project of kind of trying to relate old symbolic patterns onto a current understanding.
I find it very interesting.
Yeah.
So I come from like, I was more interested in the story elements, and he's quite often talking about what's his. He always says this. It's how the world lays itself out, or something.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's more like this hierarchy. This is the reality. This kind of system is the reality.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's wrong or anything. It's very fascinating. But I came from kind of the story perspective.
I see.
But I find him very interesting.
Yeah, he has that aspect of kind of trying to abstract out some almost like archetypal pattern or something, and then overlaying it onto
he sees
the world.
The archetypes very well, I think.
Yeah.
Identify them.
So let's see. So
how about you?
My
are you interested in the mythology part, or only in the?
Very much so. And like even as a very young kid, I had like this giant book of the world mythologies and
Yeah, yeah,
religions, and it was like my favorite book. I was always
yeah,
obsessed with it.
yeah, yeah.
You know, loved the
Cool.
drawings and all the bizarre stories.
Yes.
So that's definitely been a theme throughout my life. Granted, there was periods where it was heavily de-emphasized, and
Yeah,
later
obviously.
periods. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Interests come and go.
yeah, yeah. What was interesting too, though, was part of that cult 4 experience was a lot of really trying to uh, turn that kind of symbolic understanding of the world into a powerful tool for interpreting events. So it's like you were never we were never looking at the surface of events. You were always
Okay.
trying to look through them into,
Behind.
yes, almost this archetypal play. And perhaps this is a good bridging point between the trolls and that. That same methodology got carried over to interacting with people themselves rather than just, say, you know, looking at world events or
Yeah.
larger groups.
Also on the personal level,
Yes,
interacting with individuals.
yes. And you bring some of this up in the video, but one of the kind of realizations in doing that is that often people build up, it seems like often, excuse me, I've got like a little bit of, I ate a bowl of cereal this
Corona.
morning and I don't think the sugar and milk is helping me. Uh, it seems like people often will kind of build up the thickest aspects of their persona around their weaknesses. And in many
to
ways,
protect
that's
it.
exactly right. You put the most spackling or concrete or whatever over the crack in the wall.
Yeah, you cover it up as much as possible.
Yeah. And that's somewhat related too to the right, Adam and Eve leaving the garden and putting on the dead garments of skin.
Yeah.
And right, even looking at like primitive cultures in that sense, it's always certain regions of the body are always where the clothes will be, right? And it's generally very
Down
delicate.
there.
Yeah. So it's I guess part of it was being able to, you know, and I would say that this is also deeply tied into like the trollish behavior, is being able to find those weak points.
Yeah.
And the signal that you're using to find them is actually where it looks like the person's egoic development is like overbuilt.
Okay.
There's too much there. And then trying to find what that thing is that's creating this whole kind of rationalization process. And if you can hone in on it and touch that weak point, it has the effect of kind of like making it forces them to interact in a way that they're not used to interacting.
Okay. Do you have like a example just to?
Yeah, so like a
Explain.
blunt example, right? If you see someone that's like really aggressive in their demeanor, right, and kind of attacking, right, like a pretty safe cold read. Do you know what cold reading is?
Yeah, I think it's a reading of the person.
Yes, with very little information. So you're just trying to like,
okay.
Yeah,
interpretation from very few facts.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Generally, it's a safe bet if you're trying to get through that hyper aggressive aspect to comment on their relationship with their father.
Okay.
Right? Because usually there's some distortion to a major masculine figure that will create these kinds of exaggerated aspects of the personality. And if you can kind of like weave your way through, not usually, sometimes you can get the person to relate from a more what's the right word, open or not quite authentic, but
Vulnerable.
yes, thank you, vulnerable position. Yeah.
So was that kind of the purpose of your?
That was largely the intention. Was
it to have fun with it, or what?
It was both, really, right? But the fun was directed towards trying to get people to be vulnerable and, right, kind of real, to have a real human-to-human interaction in a place where it was generally starved, right? So in these kind of social media spaces, often it's just how much of a persona can you craft, right? And so it was trying to alleviate an underlying problem, which is that, right, all of us are quite excessively using social media out of, some lack in our social world. And yet, because of the underlying fear that we often go into the situation with, we actually are preventing ourselves from being able to use the social media in a way that it's satisfying. We kind of well, that's perhaps an interesting bit too. It's like the counter, or a different form of the opposite to a troll, which is almost like putting on too much makeup or something like that, right? It's trying too hard to create a sense of beauty.
Made a video about makeup.
Yes.
Right. I saw that.
Yes. And right, does he tie in the clownishness to that? Like, if you keep going with it, you actually will create the effect of.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think he talked about if you put up a little makeup, it's decorating what is beautiful into more beautiful. But if there comes a time when you start to hide yourself instead,
yes,
and not beautify yourself.
Yes.
Where's that limit?
Line.
Where's
exactly.
Where's the line? Yeah.
It's interesting too, going to the extreme of the clown with the permanently stuck smile or frown on their face, right? It's and in many ways we will interact socially that way. It's like the person that's always depressed on their social media existence, to the point where it's like they've lost the ability to share the little joys and those sweet moments in life, because it's no longer part of their character, or the character they've created on the thing. And of course the opposite is true as well. The person that can only share the smile and they can never reveal their difficulties in life.
That's interesting.
Oh man, I kind of lost track of where I was going with that. Oh, you asked the question if it was for fun or so it was trying to alleviate,
to open up.
Yes. And right, it's really a lot of the ironic features of the cult then were actually in many ways trying to protect people, in the sense that we wanted to make ourselves easy to ignore while still being able to kind of go really heavy.
To protect you?
No, to protect the people.
The other.
Yes. So, for example.
So they could dismiss you or something.
That's exactly it. To make ourselves easily dismissible, but also really honest. Right. So we could basically use the manipulation tool while, in some sense, forcing the other person to consent if they wanted to interact. So like calling ourselves a cult, when you do that, right, it immediately puts people's defenses up. They're like, ooh, I got to keep you at arm's, and then manipulation of language, right? Nothing was spelled correctly. Everything was hard to read, misplacing letters and stuff like that.
That started really early on the internet.
Yes.
People spelled with numbers instead of letters, and like all of this stuff.
Yes.
Before Windows was a thing, like
on calculators, I remember as a kid. Yeah. And like, a lot of that was meant to, it was meant to emphasize something in our speech. So we weren't trying to use kind of perfect spelling and punctuation or intelligence as a dominating tool.
Yeah.
Right. It's like we either hit that emotional mark or we didn't. And you could easily just, throw it away. Yeah. And then the other part of it was trying to, in some sense, reduce, and this I think gets into some of your troll comments as well, reduce the safety on our end. So, right, using your real name, using your real face.
Yeah.
And this is an aspect of the kind of troll community that is perhaps interesting in that it's largely anonymous.
Yeah. Yeah, I've never heard about trolls being open with who they are before.
Yes.
Before I heard about what you were talking about.
Yes.
In your
yes.
conversation with Paul. Because I always have the image that they are anonymous.
Anonymous. Yes. Yeah. And it's interesting because you're paying heavy costs in both cases.
Okay.
Right? Because there's something, obviously when you're using your real name and face, you're taking on the weight of your crappy behavior, right? Or areas where you mess up.
It's risky.
Yes.
Yeah, to put yourself out there.
Yes. Yeah. But I think a part that often gets missed in anonymizing ourselves is we make ourselves safe to that immediate backlash. Yeah. But the cost is in some sense our humanity. We don't get to feel like a person anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
We have to make ourselves into, like, dehumanize ourselves.
Yes. Yes.
In order to feel safe.
Yes, exactly. And so there's like a subconscious cost to that type of behavior that I think doesn't get hit on very often. So, and it's interesting trying to like calculate that risk reward ratio between those two things, and how deeply we try and keep track of our status, while still allowing ourselves some area in our life where we can kind of be the hidden piece of crap underneath that perfectly smooth, facade.
That's fascinating.
But it was interesting watching that dynamic play out in myself as well. Like kind of watching.
Did you react like emotionally to that? What did it become like a disconnect inside you after a while?
Yes. So initially it was extremely liberating because it's like, oh, I can be this unacceptable person and say, look, it's me. Like, I'm not hiding. I'm just unacceptable, right? Or unacceptable. And right, the idea of behaving like that is in some sense to grant permission to others, right? If they see you behaving in a way where it's like, look, I'm being unacceptable. Here's my name. Here's who I am. Then they go, it relaxes them a little bit and makes them think perhaps, oh, I can, be a little bit more honest when I'm typing this status. It doesn't have to be, a perfect representation of the image I'm trying to create.
You don't have to be a brand.
Yeah. And then it starts to reverse. And this is that post-ironic aspect where I turn that idea of honesty into a mask itself. And I start diving into, it's like it's almost the fundamental problem of the transgressive mindset, right? Because once you transgress, once you push outside of an area where you were morally prohibiting yourself, and you explore that area, eventually the only thing to do is to transgress again and transgress again
Just push
until,
the
and you
line
just,
further ahead.
yes, yes.
Oh.
And right, each time you're doing it, you're like, okay, I opened up a little bit more room for myself, but it starts to turn and you start becoming the troll, and you start to lose touch with that inclination that you had to try and be a better version of yourself, because you think in some bizarre way the better version is hiding somewhere in all this
beneath,
garbage
inside you. Yeah. So do you think that I described that as, if we remove all our masks, we can be authentic, we might think. But if you look in the mirror, we realize beneath our mask, we are trolls. So do you think that is, do you
absolutely
recognize
agree
yourself
with,
in
yes,
that?
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So
And
you're showing your real name, and you're showing your real face. So you're removing all these masks and say, "Hey, this is me. Look at me." And then after a while, you realize, "Wait a minute, maybe actually a troll underneath
yes,
underneath
exactly.
the masks that I thought was just hiding me, but actually,
Yes, yes. And
we fool ourselves."
we do. And it is interesting how I don't know where that myth that we think, like, if we keep removing the masks, that something more beautiful than the mask will eventually reveal itself, right? There are some, like the parable of the pearl comes to mind, right? The pearl of great price.
Yeah.
That in some sense, if you sacrifice it all, there is something that's worth it.
Yeah.
Underneath all of that. But yeah, in my experience, that's not how it played out. Or perhaps I just wasn't able to find the pearl.
Yeah, but I'm just speculating now. But maybe it has something to do with in like Gnosticism and in old Greek thinking, like the spiritual is the good and the physical and the bodily is bad, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so I think recently there's become more and more common to think of yourself as I'm a spirit with a body. I'm not body and spirit. I'm a spirit, and around me there's a body. So without this body is bad and many problems, but at the core, my soul and my spirit, this diamond, is shining.
And
but
I mean, that's a
maybe
great...
it's not that.
Yes.
We are not that shining. There are shining elements of our core, but lots of bad stuff in there as well. Usually Jesus says that it's what comes from within you, that comes out of your mouth, that is bad, not what you
that makes you dirty.
Dirty. So
that's a great one.
I think it's becoming more common to that, both in some Christian communities, I think, to think like that, but also in like New Age, it's
strong in the New Age, and even in pop culture, right? Like the idea that your gender is mutable, or your sex, not even gender, but
it comes from the same kind of
thing. It's saying my spirit is the thing that is real, and this body I can just manipulate and alter it in any way I choose, so that it matches whatever that pure spirit is.
Exactly. Maybe that has something to do with it as well. I don't know. What was your question?
No, I mean, that's just a great thing. I didn't realize how deeply that kind of Gnostic element had seeped into our yeah, even the most pop aspects of it.
Yeah.
It's interesting playing with that too, because it does raise the question of how then, right? Perhaps not how do we, but what does it look like when heaven and earth are merged in the kind of new creation, right? What is it to have the body as it is, as part of God's creation and not the demiurges? Right? How do we re-beautify the troll? Or are there any stories that deal with trolls transitioning into something other than doing it as a disguise to trick or fool?
I don't think it's very common in traditional stories.
Yeah,
I don't think so. It's more a modern concept.
I see.
Maybe.
I see. Yeah, yeah.
I'm not sure, but I don't think so.
There's like Beauty and the Beast, which somewhat plays on that trope, although it's not quite the same. Yeah, it doesn't hit the same.
Of course, there are many times that something that looks ugly, but in reality, it's beautiful.
Beautiful, yeah.
But it's because of people looking at it in the wrong way, so to speak. That's why it looks ugly.
And likewise, the thing that looks beautiful and then is revealed to be, right? That's like a witch.
Treacherous.
Yeah, right. They use the magic to create this image of perfection, and then at some point in the story, it's revealed that they're 300 years old and decrepit, and
In Sweden, we have I don't know what the name is in English, but it's like female spirits, like wood spirits. So they look like beautiful women, but they are telling like men are attracted to them, so they walk into the swamp and drown.
Oh yes.
Those kind of creatures.
Yeah.
So they look beautiful, but they are the downfall.
Deeply treacherous. Yeah. Well, and even the siren in Greek mythology plays on that.
It's the Greek version.
That's
Like
is that nymphs? Would that be the right?
Nymphs. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, there are lots of like all these names, but they kind of change from story to story. So you cannot nail down all these debates on what is the real dragon. Is the European dragon correct, or is the Chinese dragon? Or
does it have wings, or is it
does Sphinx have wings or not?
Yep.
So the Greek one they have wings, right, and the Egyptian ones doesn't. So that's how things go.
There's that Tolkien
talked a lot about that. Have you read Tolkien's On Fairy Stories? It's like an essay.
I have not. No.
It's super interesting.
Really, I need to look into that one. That sounds great.
He's talking about like the cauldron of stories. It's called On Fairy Stories. It's probably available on the internet.
Perfect. I made a little tab so I can come back to it later.
Yeah, so I was quite influenced by that essay. And he talks about the cauldron of story, and like different elements can be removed and put in, and it changes over time, and this pot is like boiling over the centuries, so there are new ingredients added and removed. And so his view on like legends was kind of an eye-opener for me. So he came to the conclusion that it's not usually you think of like King Arthur. There's this king maybe of like thousands of years ago, and then you build up legends around him, so to speak.
Yeah.
That's kind of a common view on legends.
Yeah.
There's this guy, and then after a while, after a few centuries, you build up stories around him. But he thought it was more like there are these stories and this cauldron of stories boiling over the centuries, and different people, different events in history are added into this story and changing it. So it's not legends being attached to a person, it's a person being attached to a legend.
I see.
Which is very fascinating.
Yes. So it's almost the primacy of the archetypal story itself, and then you're seeing people come up as representations of the archetype and add it in, and that actually alters the archetype over time.
And this is not like this, if you, he doesn't call it archetypes, but in his mind they are not stable. I mean, there is an ongoing dynamic process that is always boiling. So this pot is always boiling.
Interesting. So that might be a fun spot to branch into the part you talk about in your video there too, with the Christ image. And I wanted to introduce the element of idolatry and iconography as a kind of lens for dealing with that.
It's related.
And
go for it.
I'm like trying to piece it together. I can see a thread between that topic and this other one. It almost seems like the idol is in some way that thing deeply attached to the legend that allows it to alter and change shape. And it's almost like I don't know how to quite place it in words. It doesn't feel correct, but it's almost like the icon is, I don't know, it's like a layer deeper. It's in some sense watching the legend transform inside of you, or being transformed by it, perhaps.
Maybe that one, that we are being transformed by it. That's how I see it. So, for example, sometimes I'm studying theology now. So sometimes I get to preach at church. So I had this sermon about the Joseph story and his brothers. If you know, his brothers sell Joseph to Egypt as a slave, and then he turns like to this powerful guy, the right hand of the Pharaoh, and then he becomes the salvation of his brothers. In the end. And so Joseph doesn't know this at the start. He's being sold by his brothers. And his brothers, they want to get rid of him. But in this, and it's not like explicit mention in the narrative, but you can see that God is at work in this story. And it says in the last chapter, when the brothers is asking Joseph for forgiveness, Joseph says to them that God, you meant this, you meant evil for me, but God turned that into good. So he turns evil into good. He turns death into life. So it's like the Christ story. And I think for me, they are Joseph. At that, Joseph didn't understand it at the start, but in the end, he understood, like, I am inhabiting the story of God. So we are entering the big story. So in that way, I'm not postmodern. I believe in the great
The
narrative.
great narrative. Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
but it's only possible in within the Christ story, in my view. Like he becomes kind of the bridge. The like if you don't believe in a, if you're atheist, I mean, what's holding it together? There, then
yeah,
I agree that it's the postmodernists are correct. I mean, there's you have to have a foundation. So for me, it's become like this entering into the story and not taking the story as my own, but letting the story take me, so to speak.
yes,
So you enter into it and let God transform you.
yes.
And that's what I try to get at with this putting on Christ.
It's interesting too. I'm recognizing perhaps some ties to an idea I've been playing with recently, which is anatheism. Have you heard of anatheism? It's it's basically the return to God after a period of atheism.
Ah, Anna, does that mean again or back or
Yeah,
returning to
a
God?
return,
Okay.
or yeah.
Ah, okay.
It has other connotations too that are interesting,
Mm.
although I can't remember them.
Yeah.
But yeah, and part of I heard the term from John Vervaeke. I don't know if you've seen his some of his series or not, but
A couple of videos,
yeah, he
not the
brings
whole
this
thing.
up at the end very briefly, and it made me curious. So I kind of looked into it. And I had a conversation one night, and there was information brought to my attention that I could not easily immediately digest and kind of synthesize into my worldview without allowing myself to step out of the story of the Christian mythos in a sense.
Okay. Yeah.
And then right upon allowing myself to make that move, it became easy to synthesize the information, and the story grew to consume the new information.
Ah.
But there was a distinct sensation of like having to set it down, in some sense, let it die, and then let it be reborn with this new information as integrated into it.
You mean your worldview,
Yes,
your original, your
yes,
previous version of your worldview? Okay. Yeah.
exactly. And what it brought to mind was that, in some sense, it seems like one way to think of anatheism is to have a deep faith in the story itself, more so than particular figures of the story.
Mm.
And that by doing so, one is able to, in some sense, let go of an idolatrous uh, understanding of the story to let it take on this more transformative form.
Yeah.
And by framing it that way, what was interesting is that this like kind of fear or panic I was experiencing upon encountering this new information
Yeah.
suddenly dissipated, and I felt
Yeah.
totally at home because I had trust that even if
Yeah.
this thing dies, it will come back. I don't have to keep it alive myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
That's like in Swedish, the word faith, it's the same word as believe or to
okay,
think something. I think that this was a good movie, which means that people contrast know and believe and know and faith, to know
I
something
see.
or to, but like the biblical view of faith has lots of to do with trust, as you say.
Yes.
It's a trust that makes you act and follow, like Jesus always say, follow me. It's
Yep.
like a trusting faith.
Yeah.
And
It comes
then
from lower in the body. It's not up in your head. It's that
yeah,
trust that kind of,
yeah.
comes from your core.
Mm, mm.
But sorry, continue.
Yeah, but that's because if you're not trusting something that will save you, you will be afraid, of course, when you
Yeah.
meet obstacles or something that seems dangerous or threatens you. So the trust is like fundamental.
Yes. Yes.
And that's, yeah, it's
Um,
the Abraham and Isaac story.
yes. Yes. Exactly. That's a great. I did not connect that before. That's a great image for that.
That's it's both from Abraham and Isaac, because probably Isaac wasn't a little kid.
Yeah.
He was probably a grown-up man.
Yes. Well, and right,
So,
it's interesting because it takes place both as from you as the aggressor or the active participant
yeah,
and you as the passive,
yeah,
right? The one allowing or
yeah,
giving up the self, but also that which trespasses against selves.
yeah.
So you get, I like that image because you get both sides of the coin there.
Yeah, I'm doing right now. I'm writing a paper about René Girard,
Oh
if you
yeah,
know, and his view on sacrifice. So
interesting.
he talks about these two aspects. So he's very anti-sacrificial. So he thinks that sacrifice is like a ritual, sacrificial rituals. They come out of human violence,
Yeah,
and they are ritualized violence. And so he says that it's a different the Christian sacrifice is a total opposite of the old sacrifice. It's like an
the scapegoating
anti-sacrifice.
mechanism.
Yeah. So he's showing that it, real Christian sacrifice is not scapegoating something or
Yeah,
sacrificing something. It's what Christ did, or what Judah did in the Joseph story, or yeah.
yeah. And it's interesting because it takes on the external appearance of the normal scapegoating. And
Yeah, they seem similar.
yes, and I would even argue, right, it's a common, I don't know if it's fair to call it, but misapplication of Christianity to go to, in some sense, load Christ as the scapegoat of our
Mm.
sins without
Mm.
realizing that the other end of that, the part why that matters, is that it's enabling us to take responsibility.
Mm.
Right? If we just throw it away,
Yeah.
then we're back in the old scapegoat. But when it's
Jesus sacrificed himself, so it's okay now.
yes, exactly. Exactly. But if you really dig into it, it is in some sense internalizing the scapegoating mechanism instead of externalizing it, instead of throwing it out onto that thing in the world. It's loading yourself with it as a motion of liberation, not as a motion of
And
I don't know.
also a liberation of the other as well.
Yes, yes,
And
yes.
it's not like
That's a great
focused
point.
on me, it's the liberation of the other.
Yes.
It's the Christian sacrifice kind of. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Oh, that is interesting.
And he uses this. I read last week, I read a really interesting story about he's using the. Have you heard about the two? What do you call it in a more nicer word? The two prostitutes that comes to Solomon, King Solomon, who argues about a baby.
Oh, yes.
So,
Yeah. Cut them
so
in half. Yeah.
yeah. So Girard is using this story to kind of make us see the two different sides to sacrifice. So there are these two prostitutes coming to Solomon and arguing about one baby, and one of the women says that during the night like her baby, she slept on top of her baby, and so the baby died during the night. And then during the night, she swapped it to my baby. And
Yeah.
so they're arguing who's the real mother.
Yeah.
And then Solomon says, cut the baby in half.
You can each
And
have
then,
half of it. Yeah.
and then one of the women says, yes, do that. And the other woman says, no, let her have it.
Yeah.
She's the real mother.
Yeah.
So she's sacrificing the most valuable. Like, she's sacrificing in order to give the other life,
Yes.
in order for her child to live. But the other woman is sacrificing the child.
The child. Yeah.
So
yeah, one is giving up her role as mother, which ironically proves her role
that
as mother.
she is
Yeah.
the mother. Yeah. So it
that's great.
these two aspects of sacrifice.
Sacrifice. Yeah. And
there
it
should be two different words, but we just have this one word.
One word. Yeah.
So it makes it easy to.
That really brings into focus too what you just said about how this form of sacrifice enables or liberates the other. And in a bizarre way, it still is a type of liberation of the self. That you can throw away the idol of mother to become the icon of mother. You are acting in the spirit of motherhood, not the image of motherhood.
Yeah.
Right. You're willing to throw the image away.
When you give your life away, that's when you will get life.
Yes.
Yeah.
So perfect.
It's this weird thing that Jesus is. Yeah, but it's true. But it's pretty weird.
So that's okay. Let's see if we can tie this to some of the trolling as well.
Yeah.
Because can we view the troll as a type of sacrifice? And if so, how do we fit it into those two types of sacrifice?
I mean, you talked about when you're being the troll, you kind of being open with who you are. It cost you something, that you started to lose something. So in that way, you sacrifice something of yourself. I don't know. Yeah, I have to think about that.
And
I haven't connected them. I haven't thought about trolls and sacrifice.
Yeah.
There's something to it. Yeah.
I haven't either, and it just kind of popped into my head as something about giving up the mask. But then so I don't know, there's some aspect of that too, to in some sense claiming our original sin, which is kind of the admitting that I am fundamentally a troll. And oh man, see, there's some thread in here and I can't quite pick it out.
Yeah, but it's like baptism, that you die and you are baptized into Christ. So it's Paul talks about that you're baptized into Christ. So you die with Christ and are risen with Christ. So maybe that when you sacrifice your own life, you give up your own life, it has to be into Christ, because he is life, so to speak.
I guess that's an interesting point. And it's like if we don't admit to the troll, then we can't actually tell. We lose the ability to tell if the transformation is real.
Yeah,
if we
yeah,
are actually reborn or if we've just put on a better
yeah.
mask.
We have to admit it in order to die from it. Maybe,
Yes,
maybe
that's a good
something
way
like
to
that.
put it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. Yeah, that's an interesting thread, and it would be interesting perhaps to flesh out how that fails. So in the modern troll, it's almost as if there's a lack of faith. There isn't, right,
Mm.
the Christ image
Yeah.
to offer your trollish nature to.
Yeah.
And so it starts folding in on itself in some
It's
way.
like this loop
Yes.
that is you're turning into yourself. I think was that Augustine that I think he wrote that your sin is this you're bending into yourself.
Oh, really? That's a
What
great image. Yeah.
in Swedish we have this saying that you are like doing like this in your navel, like you're looking at your
Navel
navel.
gazing.
Navel
Yes.
gazing, yeah. So that's kind of if you I usually envision a shrimp like this.
Curled over. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm like suddenly
Looking into
overly
myself.
conscious of my body
Yeah,
position right now
yeah,
too.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
like hunched
yeah.
over.
Yeah, yeah,
Men with
yeah.
chests.
Yeah. But I think that's I like the shrimp image of that we just look into ourselves. So we die from our we just yeah. There's like not any goal or to it. It's just
Yes. There's no end. There's nothing
yeah.
in there. And that's interesting too, because I was having a conversation with a couple of the other guys from Paul's
Mm.
channel about authenticity
Okay.
and how authenticity has this solipsistic or even
Mm.
narcissistic aspect to it,
Okay.
which is deeply related to this troll nature, right? It's like if we do not have that larger pursuit of truth to
Mm.
contextualize our authenticity,
Mm.
then it starts looping in on itself. And we start
Yeah.
being able to rationalize any behavior,
Yeah.
we desire. And
Yeah.
yeah, it has a really
Christ has to be
deconstructive
the
effect.
image
Yeah.
that we are looking at. Yeah. The cross.
So it's always such a fine balance in that regard. And right, another thing that comes to mind again is like the authenticity of Christ in
Mm.
the sense, I think it's most deeply in the sense of his last words on the cross,
Mm.
because he basically, to be fully honest, at that moment, he
Mm.
throws away his entire ministry.
Yeah.
He goes, guys, it's wrong. I've been forsaken.
Why have you forsaken me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not there, right?
Yeah.
I think most in that position, if they'd spent their life, developing this ministry, they would
Mm.
fake it.
Mm.
They would go, nope, this is it. That's reached its culmination here.
Mm.
We would
Yeah.
continue our story out of fear of making what we did before meaningless. So it
Mm.
would be better to die in that moment with a false sense of meaning than to face
Mm.
the legitimate meaninglessness.
Yeah.
And of course, you could almost say like postmodernism then is almost like the Christian story that just stops there. It just stops at why God have you forsaken me?
Yeah.
And then the Christian story goes all the way through the bottom
Yeah.
and then
And the
recovers it, right?
resurrection. Yeah. Postmodernism is, I think it's really good to ask questions. It
Yeah.
always ends with a question mark. It feels like,
Yes.
and they can be very helpful
Yes.
sometimes.
Absolutely. Well, deconstruction is right. How do you know whether you're dealing with an idol or an
Mm.
icon,
Mm.
right? It's like
Yeah.
you can deconstruct the idols, but
Yeah.
what I think we hope is that icon, whatever that is lying, it's sitting somewhere inside of that idol. Or it's some particular way of relating, of making real, incorporating in the sense of like turn something corporeal.
Corporeal.
Embodied.
Is that embodied? Oh.
Like the word corpse uses,
okay, yeah,
has the root of corporeal. Yeah. Sorry, I kind of lost my train there.
I was going to say something. What was that? Anyway.
It floated away.
Yeah, that's life.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, it's really interesting to play with a lot of these ideas and these older stories, and then watch how the little aspects of them get in some way drinking up by the Christian story and then transformed into something novel.
Yeah.
I do really like that tie of, in some sense, admitting to original sin being this kind of recognition of the troll underneath the human, right? It's yeah. Well, where are we at? We've been going for about an hour now. Do you have any other questions, or would you like to wrap it up about here? Or... Oh, did I lose you?